I think I'm next, so I'll just start, if that's okay. And I think one of the things that's going to be evident is Zoe and I radically disagree on the meaning of media literacy and its history, in fact. I want to say right off the start that there's the formative and informing part of media literacy, which is part of the tradition, is cultural studies itself, I think, which needs to be acknowledged as one of the thought-feeding, generative traditions and critical traditions that continues to resonate through the practice, and I think needs to be taken up in a clear way in relation to the way media literacy is developed in practice. But I want to talk about, and we'll get to media literacies at the end, but what I really want to talk about, drawing on Harvey Graf's work, is I think one of the significant influences that Harvey Graf's work has had and is a precursor to, is a real transition in the thinking of literacies from something like a thing that one has or possesses, a condition that one has, and a shift to thinking about literacies as social practices. In fact, that literacy is only and ever constituted as a social practice initiated in certain situations where people do certain kinds of acts that are highly valued. And that itself has spawned a whole tradition of what is often talked about, at least in education discourses, as new literacies. And that whole field of work, I think, has generated certain kinds of helpful correctives to the thinking about what literacy is, how it unfolds, what its purpose or what its contribution can be to democratic life and a rich and thriving world. In that context, digital literacies has generated some kind of, and it's a confusing category, as I'm going to suggest. I also think there are certain things that can be extracted from the category that make it useful for projects of democratic education. At least that's what I'm going to argue at the end, particularly when it's integrated with a certain notion of media literacy, which I'll also frame for us at the end. Let me begin, though, by just unpacking some ideas about what literacy is supposed to mean for us and how some of Harvey's work changes that. So as construed up to the very recent past, literacy is typically referred to the capacity to read and write. Sometimes the term has also been used to invoke quality of writing or depth of appreciation, as the use of the adjective literate can imply. Other times, and perhaps more frequently in the late 20th century, literacy has been used to describe the lowest common denominator of participation in the literate culture, as the use of the qualifier functional literacy developed by the U.S. Army indicates. Each of these uses of the term assumes that literacy is a normal condition, a way of being and a set of abilities towards which we all strive, and from which we can interpret cultural competence. Indeed, there's a sense in which cultural participation and cultural capital are realized through various levels of literacy competency. And this is captured in things like the UN publishes literacy benchmarks as a way of talking about international development, et cetera, et cetera. Where these kinds of indicators seem to make intuitive sense in some way, it's of note that literacy in and of itself can't guarantee much for individuals. That's perhaps one of the shining lessons of Harvey Graf's work. The notion that it can forms the foundation of what has come to be called the autonomous model, an approach that treats literacy as a skill or technique that can be analyzed apart from situated practices in everyday life. On the other hand, proponents of new literacy studies have argued that literacy depends on a social context, in which literacy competencies and skills are understood as useful and meaningful. The ability to read and write or to engage in other forms of literacy only matters, in other words, in relation to a social environment where these competencies are valued and can be used. Outside such environments, literacy skills and competencies have little bearing. Literacy, in this sense, has a fundamentally social dimension. It depends on the acquisition of skills and access to and participation in social settings where those skills allow one to do certain kinds of highly valued things. Literacies, and this is from Colin Lancashire and Michelle Noble, literacies are bound up with social, institutional, and cultural relationships, in other words, and can only be understood when they're situated within their social, cultural, and historical context. We might say then that to be literate means to practice meaning-making under certain conditions. Once we begin to think of literacy in this way, it's a short step to conclude that literacy is also linked to social identities, to being certain kinds of people in specific milieus. For instance, it's difficult to separate the meaning of illiteracy from the social class or social group connotations it carries. If literacy involves social relationships, it's also clear that particular technologies of communication have generated their own benchmarks for what's to be taken seriously as literate meaning-making practices. For instance, characteristic examples of the benchmarks constituted through the frozen speech enabled by the written alphabet include the authority of the written word, cultural centrality of linear narrative, the idea that knowledge is a limited resource, etc., etc. To be sure, it's of signal importance that none of these benchmarks require having to read or write. Rather, they speak to culturally embedded notions about the value and values of literacy that have formed over time. The benchmarks of print literacy are a mind frame, in other words, a lay literacy, as Ivan Illich would say. That is, and Illich, this is from Illich, a fallout from the use of the alphabet in Western cultures. They're a distinct mode of perception, in other words, in which the book has become the decisive metaphor through which we conceive of the self and its place in the world. Recognizing the characteristics of a book-centered mind frame is important because it's precisely this form of literacy that's in transition today, given the various new literacies that are emerging. The new literacies are part of a developing cultural ethos being shaped by a changing ontology of meaning production. This is from Langsher and Noble. To say that new literacies are ontologically new is to say that they consist of a different kind of stuff from conventional, that is to say, print-centered literacies we've known in the past. It's the idea that changes have occurred in the character and substance of literacies that are associated with larger changes in technology, institutions, media, and the economy, and with the rapid movement towards global scale in manufacture, finance, communications, and so on. On the one hand, the stuff of new literacies refers to the new social practices that are developing, giving the increasingly central role of digital technologies across all the significant areas of our lives, including work, education, politics, entertainment, and leisure. At the center of these social practices are new skills and new ways of producing and distributing meaningful cultural texts and experiences through digital code. On the other hand, the stuff of new literacies also includes forms of participation with new communication technologies that are independent of keyboards, mouses, and joysticks. These forms of participation have to do with a newly developing lay literacy, as Illich would say, a cultural ethos that is not a material communicative practice, but is related to what Langsher and Noble call an insider mindset. I won't go into that. What's really important is some of the new lay literacies or mindsets that are evolving in conjunction with the increasing use of digital technologies include the assumption that many perspectives are better than just a few, that you can learn the new literacies in part on your own if you're motivated to do so, that culture is co-created, and that in the era of two-way media flow, grassroots voices can challenge the mainstream media. What's really important here is not that these are absolutely new to our era. It's the coincidence of these practices together, or these practices together. Many have, of course, come to talk about these new lay literacies in terms of digital literacy. I think it's fair to say, in fact, that talk of digital literacies has become a kind of mantra within educational policy debates at local, provincial, national, and international levels. What digital literacies refer to across these contexts is often unclear. Nonetheless, what is evident is that such discourses are nurtured by what many perceive to be a growing digital divide between what and how young people are learning outside of schools and the content and ways of learning still largely practiced in formal education settings. In general, digital literacies refer to the myriad social practices and conceptions of engaging in meaning-making mediated by text that are produced, received, distributed, and exchanged via digital codification. Such literacies, as so many of you know, leverage the dramatic development of communication technologies to enable youth expression through a variety of media forms and genres.